quick intro of Kim Nguyen-Penaloza, and I too have been practicing that name. Kim is a lifelong resident of CA-45, and she was elected to the Garden Grove City Council in 2016 at the age of 25. She was reelected in 2020 with over 75% of the vote. She describes herself as a fierce advocate for neighborhoods, championing new economic development, infrastructure projects, and park rehabilitation while reducing crime and homelessness. Kim was the first to throw her hat into the ring to challenge Michelle Steele. She is the child of a Vietnamese refugee father and a Mexican immigrant mother, which allows her to understand the challenges of those communities, which are heavily represented in the district. She is currently working as a project manager in the healthcare industry. She is having a child soon, and I mentioned her pregnancy because she has woven it into her campaign as a way to normalize working women of all kinds. Congratulations and welcome, Kim.
Well, thank you all so very much for having me here. I'm so grateful for the time and the opportunity because this, as all you know, that this race is extremely important. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So I'll touch upon some of the things that were already mentioned, but I'll go into a little bit deeper detail. As mentioned, Kim Nguyen-Penaloza. There's no official Enya on there, but it's Penaloza. I am the daughter of a Vietnamese refugee and a Mexican immigrant. I am one of 8 children. I am the first in my family to graduate high school and go on to a 4-year university. I have always known that I wanted to be a public servant. From a very young age, I saw a lot of the differences between my parents when I was with them or separately or together, and how we were treated, opportunities afforded to them, resources. And one of the most distinct memories that I've shared a lot, so those of you who have heard me speak have heard this already, I apologize, but it's something that just has stuck in my mind since I was very little. And I remember going to the store with my mom and having to guide her on how to use food stamps, but having her not listen to me and get the wrong items, get name brand versus generic brand, and then us holding up the line and having people murmur behind us because they were so frustrated that we were holding up the line, and having to speak English to her, or English to the cashier, Spanish to her. And I remember being embarrassed, but because I didn't understand, the sacrifices that she made to ensure that I had what I needed because she wasn't able to do it by herself. And that's something that I began to learn as I got older. And for me, that was kind of the beginning of all of it. I, for whatever reason, tied that to being in 1st grade and deciding that the people that I saw on TV, predominantly white men who were in fancy suits in front of a podium giving speeches on TV, were the ones that were making decisions about me, my family, and my community, but they didn't look like me, my family, and my community. So I said from that moment on that I needed to be president of the United States of America. I ran my first campaign in 1st grade in Mrs. Worker's class, and it said, "Vote when now." I was being cheeky with my last name. And at the bottom in parentheses, it said 2028 or 2032, because I had calculated that I'd be 36 and eligible in 2028. And if I didn't get it the first time, I would try again in 4 years. And that, that was the beginning. My parents are not political, so I had no idea how I was going to accomplish this. But I was fortunate enough to have so many teachers in my life who, when they asked me what I wanted to be, and I said president, they didn't write me off. If anything, they encouraged me, they challenged me, and they pushed me to work even harder, because they knew that it would be harder for me. Not only being, the daughter of immigrants, not only being a woman of color, from a non-affluent background, they knew that I would have to struggle. And so they made sure to be supportive and push me and make sure that I would be successful. And as a result of that, I was in the AVID program and was able to make it to a 4-year university. I'm a very proud banana slug, and that is very relevant if you know anything about Michelle Steele. She pulled her daughter out of Santa Cruz because they were brainwashing her to support gay rights, which is ludicrous. And so while I was in Santa Cruz, I had the good fortune of having a professor who was a sitting council member, and he gave me extra credit to go to his council meeting. And that was my first taste into local government. I had never been to a council meeting beforehand. And, I was amazed because I didn't know how many of you, maybe all of you who are much more active, but when you're young, you don't know the difference between a county board or a council or a water board or school board. These are the elected people. And I really only know the ones that are famous on TV. So it was very eye-opening experience for me. And when I graduated, I came back and I interned and volunteered for then Senator Lou Correa, who is now a Congress member. And that was my first taste into state government, but also local politics, which here in Orange County can be very nasty for those who are familiar. And in 2016, I did some research and came across the fact that Anaheim was all over the news because they were switching from citywide elections to districts. And I got curious to see what Garden Grove was doing, and to my shock and surprise, sorry, you guys, I get out of breath when I'm pregnant. I have her pressing against my lungs. So if I sound like I'm running, it's because I feel like I am. And to my surprise, Garden Grove had also been sued and was moving to district elections. And so I looked at the maps that were being presented as options, and I felt that they didn't match the city at all. They looked very gerrymandered, in my opinion. And so I thought to myself, I've got some free time. Let's try to draw a better map. And so I looked at a couple different resources, and I put together a map, and I shared it with someone in Orange County who is very much respected for creating really well-drawn maps. And I took it to a few community leaders, made a few changes, and then I submitted it. And from February to about May of 2016, I was faced with a lot of adversity, a lot of racism about my map, but ultimately it won 5-0. So the Kim Nguyen map is the map they use in Garden Grove now. And shortly thereafter, in July, right before my 25th birthday, I was not impressed by the candidate who was running for my district, because Garden Grove had been sued for the lack of Latino representation. In the 50+ year history, there had never been anyone from Latino descent to serve on the council, despite 1/3 of the population being Latino. So I felt that that person had to be, strong and really hungry to want to impact change, because this population in Garden Grove had been disenfranchised and neglected, and we really needed a champion. So I decided to throw my hat in the ring as a 24-year-old working and paying rent and school loans and all the other things. I felt I don't want to be part of the problem. I want to be part of the solution. And so despite everyone telling me I was too young, I hadn't paid my dues, and that I had to wait my turn, I said, F it, I'm going to do it anyways. I think I could do a good job, and we'll see what happens. And to my surprise, I beat the older gentleman by 13 points. So that was truly amazing. And in 2020, I won my re-election with over 75% of the vote, which was the second highest margin of victory in all of Orange County that year. And so that is kind of what gets us to this point. For those of you who are familiar, I did run unsuccessfully for county supervisor last year. And I thought I was done. November rolled around, I lost, although I was winning election night. I did ultimately lose, and I thought, here's the time where I'm going to take a break. I'll get married, have babies, and maybe see if there's something else for me in the future, thinking that, I lost, no one's going to want me to run for anything. But I got the call for service by several elected individuals who I respect, community leaders who I admire. Everyone encouraged me to run for this seat because it is 50% plus Asian and Latino, and why fight for one when you can have both? And so I, talked to my now husband and my campaign manager from all of my other campaigns, and they said that there's a path to victory, and we think that you can do it. If anyone, it's going to be you. And I still wasn't sure, so I called a number of the local city council members just to ask them, hey, are any of you interested? What are you hearing? Who are we supporting? Because I don't want to come in when we have other people in the pipeline. We need to pick one if we really want to beat Michelle Steele. We can't have a crazy primary. We have to focus our efforts. Last cycle, I gladly endorsed Jay Chen, and I walked for Jay. I was committed to that. And so I wanted that to kind of be the same theme that we were doing this year. And they all basically volunteered me as tribute and said, nope, you're going to do it. And I said, thank you. And so by the end of the day, I had 20 endorsements without even having officially announced. And so it just sort of happened, and we were running for Congress. And here we are now. We have over 80 endorsements. We've endorsed by the California Dem Party, by Labor Federation, California Young Dems, and a whole very long list. I don't think I saved anything for anyone else. And so that is kind of my driver. This is personal for me. I'm elected here. I have a job to do, and Michelle Steele makes it very difficult. I am a resident, and I feel like my needs aren't being met. I have friends and family who are still living with their parents, who are deeply impacted by the state of things. And for me, having served, lived, worked, I literally lived 2 doors down from my childhood home, within minutes from my elementary, middle, and high school, and probably 4.5 minutes away from my parents. I know that she needs to go, and I'm very passionate and devoted, and will fight as strong as I can to make sure I retire her in November. And with that, I will need everyone's support. And so I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak to all of you. This is going to be an all hands on deck type of situation, and I'm counting on you guys to help support me so we can make sure that she's gone, because together we will be stronger than steel.
Wow, that was pretty exciting. Great. Okay, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you some questions.
Please.
Okay, so I have to tell you, Indivisible South Bay LA, we picked CA-45 last year too, and we wrote a bunch of letters into the district, and we knocked on doors, and we did lots of things, and we were really, really disappointed when Jay lost. I have the data in front of me. Michelle won at 53.6%. What do you think you learned from that election, and what would you do differently to have a different outcome this time?
My hot take, for what it's worth, is we really need someone who's from this district, who understands the community. I know every congressional candidate in every district is talking about how their district is really unique. But I can promise you that 45 really is. It's that little Saigon element that really changes a lot of things, and that hidden Latino population that is much more than the Vietnamese population, that people don't account for. They really need someone they can trust, someone who speaks their language, someone who they're comfortable with, have known, to really get them out to vote. And with the presidential election, we have no excuse. And so I think, when you have a non-presidential election, a candidate who's not well known within the district, there's just obstacles there that you can't really overcome with, doesn't matter how much money you have. And so while Michelle Steele had never represented this area prior to running for the 45th and after redistricting, she did have name ID in Orange County. And so people may have not really understood why they knew her name, but they knew her name. And so I think that that's what sets us apart in this race this time. And I think all of the critical pieces are in place. And I think this is the prime time to take her out once and for all.
Do you think people in the district understand her voting record and what she stands for?
No. I can tell you for a fact they don't, because I receive a lot of emails from her staff directed to City Hall about all these great things and all this money that's coming down. And I have to constantly respond to my staff and say she voted no on that. Like, don't even bother giving her credit, because we're getting all this infrastructure monies and she voted no. And so if this is how they're messaging and this is what people are believing, then it's safe to say that other non-politically aligned people that are not really paying attention to the votes are going to believe that, because that's the messaging she has. Like, we've drawn down X million dollars for infrastructure or this or that, and she had nothing to do with it. So perception is reality, unfortunately.
Yeah, we see that all over the country, right? People in the House taking credit for all these bills they didn't vote for. So how do you get a message like that out? Michelle Steele didn't vote for infrastructure, but she's taking credit for it. How do you get that out to her voters?
I think it's really pointing out the voting record. There, you can Google it, you can look it up, it's public, but people don't know to look for that. People aren't pointing to that. So we want to make sure that we're doing that when we're talking to voters and let them know. And if they don't believe me, I'll carry a little QR code with somewhere to link to her voting record if I have to. But it's critical that they understand that despite her messaging, that's not the truth. And I also want to be able to not just, I don't want to do a hit on her, but I want to be able to contrast, compare, because I have 7 years worth of a voting record of things that I've accomplished in the city of Garden Grove, and we are leading the way on so many different fronts. So I want to be able to stack the nothing got done lies versus here's what you could have, and hope that voters are like, we want that. We want someone who's going to work hard, because I think for folks who have encountered me politically and through the city government, they know that despite being, because there's a lot of Republicans here in Orange County, but despite being a Democrat, that I've been pretty efficient as far as devoting dollars to critical infrastructure needs in the city of Garden Grove. And implementing mental health programs, helping homelessness and housing. And so I don't think anyone can argue that I don't work hard.
Oh, okay. So zooming out, we had an election nationally just a month ago. And in a lot of places like Kentucky and Virginia, things went very well for Democrats. Are there any lessons you can learn from that election? Are there any takeaways? Does that change the way you think about running your own race? What did you learn from that election?
As far as my particular race, I think, I've seen this issue time and time again, and so I'm not taking anything for granted. I'm running like I'm losing, and I'm working 200% plus, 300% if we count the little girl inside my belly. But I think what worries me about that is that I don't want people to become complicit and think that we're going to be okay. I think the issue sometimes is that people think, oh, California, we're not going to be impacted by these things, and those who are not in places like Orange County that typically, turn red, are not thinking on that scale. And so I'm really hoping that folks across the state that are in safe blue seats realize that they really need to dedicate some time and energy into helping us flip these very flippable seats. I mean, 45 was a +6 Biden district. There is no reason why Michelle Steele should be in this seat. And we need help getting her out because she just has that Steele machine and her husband in the Republican Party where, I'm not going to speak nationally or statewide, but I can say that I've seen the ramifications of the delays on our party locally. Republicans pick their candidate and just throw hordes of money at them and they get elected. And I think for us, it just takes a little longer. And sometimes it's to the point where we lose seats. And so I'm just hoping that doesn't happen again in this situation.
A lot of people on this call got involved after Trump was elected, and we saw Orange County. A lot of us worked hard in 2018. We ran the deck in 2018. We saw the whole house flip in Orange County, but then we saw a lot of it flip back. And so you are talking to a lot of terrified activists who understand that it's really hard. And I think a lot of us are very, very motivated and very scared. So we are not the people you're worried about in terms of thinking that it's going to be easy. I think the thing that we'll need to understand from you is how best we can help you. That's probably the biggest question. So.
Other than the generic thing of fundraising, donations is welcome. We need people on the phones, calling, texting. We need people, those who are able and willing to come out and walk, write letters, postcards, all the things that you have been doing. We need all of that and then some. And we all need to be running on 100 cylinders and putting all our efforts into this, because this is one seat that will get flipped as long as the work is there to match it.
Yeah. And as Patty has mentioned, we are not an organization that endorses, but if people want to get in touch with the campaign directly, they are more than welcome to do that. And it is never too soon to start. Yes. Okay. So, in terms of issues, well, let's talk about young voters. You're in your early 30s, which is unusual for someone running for the House. How do you intend to motivate young voters in your district? They'll be very important to you winning this race.
Yeah, given that there's about 30% of them in my district between the ages of 18 and 35, and I'm still a strong 32. I haven't aged out of being a young Dem yet. For me, it's really about getting out there and meeting with them, inspiring them to get involved and inspiring them to believe in me and this campaign, in that I'm going to be there to work with them. Right. I work for them. I work with them, and not so much just taking their free labor. As someone who has been an intern, who has had to do the grunt work, I always hesitate to try to bring on interns because I just don't like the idea of making young people work for free. But many of them, I've said this and they still say, no, Kim, you don't have money to spend. We'll volunteer our time. We want you to win so that you can help change it once you're in. But really, and that's what, if anything, motivates me even more, because I know that I'm one of them and I've gone through their struggles. I haven't passed it. I still live almost paycheck to paycheck after purchasing my first little home, which is the size of a shoebox, I like to call it. It's 548 square feet, and it depleted my entire savings. When I ran for office, I had to give myself $2,000 to just start campaign stuff. And I was eating cup of noodles and off the dollar menu for the entire campaign, to the point where my campaign manager would bring me food because he was concerned that I wasn't eating. And so this is something that they identify with. All of my friends that I went to high school with that are still in Garden Grove live at home with their parents despite being in their 30s, because they either can't afford to leave or their parents can't afford them to leave because they need help. And so this is something that I have experienced and I can speak to. And cost of school, we're drilled in our brains that we have to go to college at a very young age, and then we come out of school with a lot of debt and we don't get really high paying jobs right away, and there's this frustration. And I can speak to all of those things and help them navigate that and provide them opportunities. And I've helped a lot of young people who have run for office by giving them the best advice that I possibly can. And I've also encouraged them to just do it, because if you don't, someone else will, and our perspectives will get lost. And so I think it's really important for them to know that and see that. And also see someone who's Vietnamese who's running for office, because young Vietnamese people, while are starting to get more involved politically, we don't see many of them holding positions in elected offices or running for office, at least not in the Democratic side. And so have encountered a lot of young, especially women who are Vietnamese and who, you know, are just motivated in seeing that it's possible, and that we can find ways to bridge gaps between our generations, because the older Vietnamese community here tends to be very conservative. And so it's really just getting out there and talking to them.
You mentioned housing. In so much of California, housing is unaffordable for younger generations, especially in dense parts of California like Orange County. What do you see as a longer term solution for that issue?
Housing is the bane of my existence right now. As a city of Garden Grove was allocated over 19,000 units that we have to build to fulfill our RENA allocation. And we are a city that's 75% built out. And despite being the 5th largest city in all of Orange County, we are a bedroom community that's trying to transition into modern times, but we get a lot of pushback. And so, you know, for me, it's unfortunately more housing is going where things are already dense, which happens to be my district. And as much as I try to push back on it, realistically, that's just where housing is going to have to go, because it's the point of, you know, transit access, point of jobs. And that's where they want to see housing being built, so that people are not having to travel far to get to work or home or to some major thoroughfare or freeway. And so it's frustrating for me, because I want more housing built everywhere and all kinds of housing. I don't believe in just creating apartments, or I think that we need to find a happy middle, get creative with it so that young people and others have a starting place, a middle, and then a path to home ownership. Because despite what some may think, millennials like myself and those that are younger, we want our own homes. We want the picket fence and the, you know, the barn door or whatever that saying is about picket fences. And it's just that it's become impossible for us to do that. It's not that we don't want it. And so we've kind of ruled it out of our minds. And so for me, it's looking at is there ways to have, you know, to build housing that starts us at renter friendly, and have some that are for purchase, you know, condos, townhomes, and merge those two together, because it's also our first time home buyer programs are unrealistic. The minimum requirements for that are so low that you wouldn't be able to survive off of it. And so how does anyone qualify for it? There's all these different things that are at play with housing, and it's something that I've been working really hard to try to figure out, and how best to help. But at this point, we just need to get a lot more people that are like-minded elected to office, who are willing to put pen to paper and figure out how we make that become a reality, rather than something we just continue to complain about.
Also, I would imagine, as related to younger voters, both gun safety and climate, I would think, are issues that are really important to younger people. What are your sort of short-term policy thoughts about both of those issues? You were elected to Congress.
Yeah, so I'll start off with gun control. For me, that's extremely important. You know, a lot of folks, especially Gen Z, likes to say that they've grown up with shooter drills, active shooter drills, and all of these mass shootings. And I will say, so have millennials. And I will say that so have poor people in low-income communities. That's something that we've lived through almost every day while we were at school. As you mentioned, you know, my staff person, Ariana, is here. She and I went to high school together. We graduated the same year. I remember being on lockdown at least once a week, if not more, from shootings or stabbings. And For me, it's like, this is our everyday life. Like, talk about active shooter drills. We're probably the queens of figuring out how to survive and hide. I mean, it's unfortunate. And now it's this bigger thing, and it's happening in bigger numbers, and it's extremely scary. I know, for one, you know, I get nervous when I go to big crowded places. Aside from being an introvert, although it may not seem like it, I am. I secret that I'll share here is that I have you guys all in gallery rather than speaker, because I don't like to look at myself. Um, so it makes me nervous. I don't know that I shared this earlier in my bio, but I'm also a survivor of rape. And so I'm already hyper vigilant as it is, especially when I'm alone, and even more so at night when I'm pumping gas even during the day. And you see horrific things. A couple weeks ago, we had a young high school student sexually assaulted in broad daylight at a major intersection on her way to high school. And for me, all of these things are impacting my communities. It's not just, you know, the one-offs on the news that happen once a month that we all send our thoughts and prayers. This is happening every day in my community. And I don't know what the solution is other than getting rid of guns off our street, and instituting more securities and oversight, and really also, unfortunately, teaching our students and young people and just everyone in general how to be safe and how to respond, so that we're not just sitting ducks in, or deer in headlights, you know, trying to figure out what do we do next, or how do we get out. Things are just getting more volatile, and I think they will continue to do so before things get better, and we all need to be prepared, and that's just unfortunate. And in regards to climate, I want nothing more than to go green and have a healthy planet for future. Now that I have little Bebecita here, that's what we call this little nugget, Bebecita. She doesn't have a name yet. But realistically, many of us can't afford that. I'm still driving my 10-year-old beat up Subaru. I would like to say that my next car will be full electric, but I don't have the means to accomplish that right now. And when we talk about going solar, I don't know anyone in my close-knit circle, neighborhood, or community or district in Garden Grove that could afford that. And many of us live in apartments or condos where, like, I have a neighbor upstairs. I'm not in control of that. That's the HOA, and HOAs are heavily unregulated. And so I don't want people to get left behind. And I want to make sure that when we're talking about climate change, we're also talking about the transition of jobs, not just for engineers and the people who are working in that capacity, but drivers, people who rely on these skilled and trained apprenticeship programs and positions and union jobs to make sure that they have something too, because many of them have been doing their jobs for 20 plus years, 15 years. They're not going to want to learn the new tech and switch over, but what's the plan for them? And so for me, it's really getting all of that information and making sure I'm making the best choices and taking everything under consideration. While we all want to happen tomorrow, like a switch of a light, that's not possible, or else we would have already been there. And rather than forcing it to happen, I think we all need to sit down at the table, really work through that and figure out all the little gaps and holes so that everyone's comfortable with that transition, and ensuring that we're not exacerbating existing issues with our low-income communities any further.
I know you work in the healthcare industry, and you've talked about concerns about rising costs and access to care. Tell us more about some policies that we can expect to see from you in healthcare.
Yeah, I've been working in the Medi-Cal space for the last almost 10 years now. I was lucky enough to start right out of college when the Affordable Care Act was emerging, and we were going through a lot of the hardships of getting folks enrolled and processing their paperwork when there was a lot of delays. So I went through all of that, working at Cal Optima, which is the Orange County's organized healthcare system for Medi-Cal specifically. I no longer work there, but I was there in the trenches during that period of time. And for me, I am a strong advocate for universal healthcare. I want people to be able to have a choice in their healthcare provider and network. Many folks get insured through their work, and that's the way that they want to keep it. And, you know, private insurance is very much entrenched in our healthcare system, so I want to be mindful of that. But I think that there should be a baseline of coverage for everyone, and that we all have that option if we so choose, and build upon that. And I think I always say Medi-Cal expansion because we did it in 2014, where we increased the income levels. I mean, like, let's just inch our way more and more and more until that kind of becomes the way of the land, right? Because again, the support there for single payer does not exist, or we would have already been there. But we also know that with a country this size, it may not work as a great comparison to the other countries that have that. You see that salaries are lower for doctors and those in that industry in other countries where they have single payer, and we have a significant detrimental critical retention rate here in the United States as far as healthcare, especially after the pandemic. Hordes of people left the industry not wanting to deal with it anymore, that are emotional, financial, physical, all of these things played a role in that, and they left the industry. And so we want to make sure that whatever decisions we're working towards builds in safety nets for everyone, not just those trying to get better access to care, but those who are working in the field. And I think we really need to invest in training and education for more people to come back into the industry and incentivize them to do so. Because one thing we desperately need is more cultural and language sensitivities among our healthcare providers. And we need to make sure that a group of people who don't know what it's like to have reproductive healthcare issues not make the decisions for us in that regard as well.
Well, I'm glad you pivoted to that, because that was my next question. And you mentioned that in one of your videos. I think that Republicans, for some reason, have not really caught on to the fact that abortion is not really working for them in elections. How does that play in your district? What are you hearing from voters about abortion access and care?
Well, I am unequivocally supportive. I will do whatever it is, even if it's my last breath, to fight for reproductive health for a variety of personal reasons. Aside from, as I mentioned, I am a survivor. I was raped when I was 18, and I'm blessed that I didn't have to resort to any other means. But I did have to access Planned Parenthood without my parents' knowledge. So I'm glad and thankful for that organization. And last year, I unfortunately suffered a miscarriage. And that was one of the hardest, probably the hardest thing I'd ever had to go through. And no one talks about it. And I felt so by myself. And, the stigma around any medication to assist with that miscarriage and the taboos around that. I was fortunate. I guess fortunate may not be the right word, but I didn't have to. I was able to go through the process by myself physically and endure it all. But it was scary, and I didn't know what to do. And there wasn't a lot of people for me to rely on. And unfortunately, physicians were very insensitive, because I think they see it so often that they kind of just wrote it off as, it's a Tuesday. This happens all the time. Whereas it was happening to me for the first time, and I didn't know what to do. And I've been the strongest advocate as I possibly can be here in Orange County. Very vocal. I've stepped up when we had young interns and workers who were being sexually assaulted and their livelihoods were being threatened. I was the only one to step up and really fight on their behalf. And that will never change. But I will say that this district is a little complicated. You have a lot of Catholic Latinos, and you have a lot of conservative Asians. And these conversations aren't happening at home. I've been in uncomfortable situations where I've had to have these discussions with my families on both sides, the Vietnamese and the Mexican side. And I choose not to talk about it with them anymore as a result of that. Just when I really have to, when I need to press a vote or a particular issue with them, when someone mentioned school board, we have that same issue with Orange, and my parents live in Garden Grove, but they live in Orange Unified, and conversations about gay rights and sex education come up, and I will fight and I will argue and I will make them do what they ask, or I threaten to never speak to them again. So sometimes I have to resort to that. But when you're talking to the community, I remember in 2016, I went to my friend's house, who I went through elementary, middle, and high school with, to ask for her parents' vote and signature for my nomination papers. And they denied me because they were very strong Catholics. And the one question they asked me and only cared about was abortion. And I unwaveringly said that I'm supportive. And so they shut the door in my face, and I had to go on to the next house. Sometimes you win some, sometimes you lose some. And that's just how it's going to go. But I will not lie about my position on this issue. And if it means putting myself in an extremely triggering, traumatic, and vulnerable position, I share my personal story, because then people can't really argue with me. It's something that I lived through personally, and they cannot like it, but I'm sure they would not want me to die on the street right in front of their house if it was medically necessary for me to get the assistance that I needed. And so I try to put a person to the story for them to try to slowly win them over. Because if you don't want to have an abortion, don't have one. But you shouldn't have to force that opinion on me. And that's kind of the messaging that I try to get through. Because it's going to be very tricky with a specific district.
Yeah, I can understand that. I think one thing a lot of us have learned is that the continuum from abortion to healthcare is it's very gray, right? And so I hear you that it's a tough conversation to have. All right, we are close to out of time, so I have a couple more questions. You've been running the gauntlet. You mentioned LGBTQ rights. Boy, the Republicans really are not holding their fire with just saying horrible things. And in state legislatures, they're doing terrible things to trans kids all over the country. What are your positions about LGBTQ rights?
Pretty much the same as I feel about women's reproductive rights. Not only do I just support, I know that I went under a lot of attack when I tried to proclaim Pride Month in Garden Grove and then tried to have the flag placed in the lobby. But that was small compared to what is actually happening out there. But I did get a taste of it and it was not fun. But I stood my ground and I got my way, and I think we get a clock tower on a very busy street that has rainbow lights and a pride flag every June. So I'm grateful for that. But it's also a personal issue for me. My younger sister, who's 9 years younger than I am, came out a few years ago, and she suffered a lot as a child, growing up in a Latino community household, and a lot of that machismo. Not only her mental but her physical health deteriorated as a result of that, and I know that that's preventable. Those types of situations don't have to be present, and I think it always starts with education. These are conversations that need to be had, and they need to be had at a very young age, and young people need to be having them with their parents and their grandparents and their uncles and their aunts and everyone in their family, as comfortable as they are. But if we continue to not talk about it and address it, the situation will not improve. And so for me, whenever I can, I just try to paint this picture of, what does it matter? It's not affecting you or your life. Like, let love be. You're just gonna bog yourself down with this negative attention for no reason and stress yourself out when it has no impact on you. I know I have this conversation quite frequently with my dad, as I mentioned, the Orange Unified School District. And we'll get into fights. I will storm out of the house. I almost left my husband there when we went over for dinner one time. And, it's not that my dad doesn't care about people, but sometimes he gets bogged down by the narratives that are being placed out there. And I think that there's just too much of the negative and not enough of the full story, because there are things that he'll tell me and I'm like, that is not even remotely close to the truth, Dad. Like, here, read this. But what he sees and what he hears is painted so dark and nefarious that he believes it. And I think that that's what we have to counter. And again, I think sometimes we just shy away from having uncomfortable conversations, because one, it impacts us mentally and physically, emotionally, to have these conversations. But that's just how I go about it, is no matter how I feel about it, I just continue to push through, because if not me, then who? I would love to pass the baton to someone else, but there's currently no one there. So until that happens, or until I can convince Ariana to run for my council seat and take over, I will continue to carry the torch and push the message. And I've been fortunate enough to have a network of supportive people who, when I'm down or feeling some type of way, or they notice that some changes in my behavior or mood, that they check in on me. And I think that's what's important, because we're all in this fight together. And whether we want to put on a brave face and just say we're okay, sometimes we're not. And I think that we all have to look out for each other, because all of these topics are extremely heavy, and it gets tiring. To be honest, I always say that serving in this capacity has been the biggest blessing of my life, and I love it. It's so gratifying to see my work into action, but it's also the biggest sacrifice I ever made, to dedicate 7 years of my prime youth while my friends are out and about. I was sitting in council meetings with people double my age, and having to prove my worth and my expertise. And but that's just how the fight goes. Enough of us have to do it until more follow.
So I could ask you 1,000 more questions, but I won't because our time is up. I want to say I think you are a really unique voice, and I so much appreciate your honesty. And thank you so much for spending time with us tonight. We look forward to seeing how you do in the primary and staying in touch with you.
Thank you all so very much. I really appreciate the time and allowing for the space to kind of be vulnerable and honest. That's one thing I will always be, is I wear my heart on my sleeve, no matter how painful it is. So I'm glad to have a safe space to do that. Thank you.